Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural South African Equestrian Federation podcast from the horse's mouth, a new initiative aimed not only at communicating with the equestrian fraternity of South Africa, but to connect them. Tonight, we kick off with a hot topic for competitors in South Africa, but also for horse lovers in general, the shortage of the African horse sickness vaccine and what that means for everyone, from dispensation to correct vaccination protocols. We're going to discuss that with our South African Equestrian Federation President and Professor Sanne, as well as FEI Veterinarian Dr. Sheelagh Higgerty, who have joined us here in the studio today to help us discuss how best to protect our horses and the necessity of a cohesive and comprehensive vaccination program for the benefit of all equestrians in South Africa. Let me introduce tonight our President, Sanne. Ian himself, of course, no stranger to the horse world, and also professor of infectious diseases, the Vice Chair of the AIDS Clinical Trials Group International, which is responsible for overseeing research at 25 international sites in 13 countries. So I think that means the horse fraternity will pose no problem for Ian. And secondly, our veterinary savant tonight, Dr. Sheelagh Higgerty, a vet of 40 years, FEI official and treating veterinarian in 6 disciplines, Chairperson of the SAEF's Veterinary Commission, Chairperson of the South African Equine Veterinary Association Sport Horse Committee, and National Head Veterinarian in South Africa for the FEI. Thank you both for joining us tonight in the studio.
Thanks, Georgina.
Thank you. Ian, shall we kick off with a little bit about what's happened with SAEF in the last year, but also just discussing a little bit the role of the South African Equestrian Federation?
Yes, so thank you very much first for the invitation and for organizing all of this. I think that it's been certainly a baptism by fire for the president
Yes,
and the new committee. We took over at a time that there was actually a fair amount of controversy, a fair amount of hangover of litigation and all kinds of things. So my first task and that of the new executive was to settle a number of those disputes, to in fact bring calmness to and more cohesiveness and cooperation. Indeed, also with SASCOC, who is a key stakeholder in SAEF, and also the Department of Sports and Arts and Culture. Sometimes I say sport and agriculture, which is wrong. Sports, arts and culture. That indeed are substantive funders of SAEF and the sport. So we went about that in the first period. Our key elements remain, which is membership, horse registration. The key functions of the SAEF include looking after the various disciplines and associate disciplines to try and find a cohesive constitution, retain that constitution.
Make everyone happy.
Try and keep everybody happy, not always able to do that, because indeed also one of the functions is to oversee disputes that may occur between members and the various disciplines, but only after they've followed the processes from within the discipline.
In other words, please follow the processes.
Follow the processes, otherwise we get stuck and then it all can't be decided upon. So some of the programs that I think have come in, that are being introduced, is a much stronger focus on the welfare of the equestrian athlete, and Sheelagh is clearly responsible for that. But we have, in fact, authorized through our budget processes more direct testing.
That's part of which is a topic we'll cover in the future, I believe, the doping.
Right, and the direct testing is not only of elite horses, but in fact across the board.
Okay.
And I think it's almost a warning to membership that indeed we will be seeking to root out the mid-level doping of horses, if I could put it as bluntly as that. The second element that has very strongly come out in the recent time is the safeguarding of the athletes through our safeguarding policy, and we're rolling that out. This is safeguarding, again, from a doping point of view, but also safeguarding in terms of harassment and
This was the US pretty much led this with Safe Sport.
yeah, so this
Okay.
Safe Sport, it follows the SASCOC policy. We, in fact, have got varying degrees of this occurring, so it can be just intimidation of fellow riders, but then with graduation into more serious forms of safeguarding that we need to follow.
Great.
I'm very keen on promoting the role of the grooms in the sport. And
Excellent.
have been in negotiation with Gauteng particularly, but with the Gauteng Sports Confederation to include the awarding of colours, provincial colours, not only to
That's
the
amazing.
rider, but also to the groom. And in fact, we'll be
wonderful.
testing that in the upcoming interprovincial competitions. We hope that the other provinces will follow as well. We are very much into driving equity. So the whole question of equity amongst to bring up athletes, black athletes,
Okay.
is a key element. However, I would defer to the disciplines and feel
Yeah.
that in fact it's the
So
disciplines
each
that need to do
discipline
that.
does have a transformation and development portfolio.
Correct. And
that they
whereas
need to
my intent is actually to create employment in this arena
Great.
under SAEF, and so we'll be initiating the first training of officials, particularly focused at black officials, so stewardship, stewards, and potentially judges.
Where do people find more information about that, Ian, if they want to join it or nominate someone for it?
So it's actually about to be released,
Okay,
right?
great.
So just
Sorry,
there,
jumping the
the
gun.
Exco has just approved the budget.
Wonderful.
In fact, the budget does not come from membership fees. We've managed to secure Department of Sport funding for this. I do believe the first round will be around 50 black, potentially engaged people, so grooms, etc., who would like to become officials. And we're hoping that the disciplines will follow and start actually doing, I think show jumping, for example, has done a great job of course builders, but create equity employment
Wonderful.
in the arena. We are wishing to standardize coaching further and have initiated a coaching commission. We'll be following FEI standards for that, for the FEI disciplines, but hope to in fact move forward with the other disciplines as well. I'm going to be quicker now because otherwise we're never going to talk about vaccine. So overall, we're trying to bring more to membership. One key element that I would like to raise is the whole question of unsanctioned shows, which you as a dressage
topic.
person would have as a hot topic. My approach to that is that, and that of the EXCO, is that we would like to rather invite members to join the federation at no cost. So we've made entry level no cost at the federation level. We've encouraged the disciplines to do that the same. And we're encouraging the disciplines to, in fact, create an environment in which those unsanctioned shows become part of the discipline rather than being outside.
And I think, again, the point is always coming down to welfare. So
Correct.
welfare issues that occur under unsanctioned shows, there's no opportunity to escalate them or for there to be real consequences.
Correct. So if a show holding body decides to have an unsanctioned show, we have removed the what's it called? The disciplinary process. So in fact,
So it would protect the members. It's in their
so
interest.
we would like to create an environment where people choose
Okay.
to go to a sanctioned show. We're not going to enforce unsanctioned shows, but we're also not going to take responsibility for unsanctioned
Fair
shows. And also judges can move between the two. We took all of that out of the
That's
general
great.
regulations. So, however, ultimately, let's have one federation and bring all members in.
Well, I think everything that you've mentioned so far generates a great value offering to the average equestrian. So it makes sense when you see the programs that are in place and the wonderful initiatives that are rolling out with high performance and development programs, standardizing coaching. It does make a better inclusive, more quality sport for everyone.
Correct. We're leading up to constitution changes. The first consultation will occur around the AGM. Our AGM is delayed by the fact that we did change auditors. But we will have the AGM in the next couple of months, and then we will, in fact, also be consulting on potential shifts in the constitution, and we'd ask members and folks to look out for that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Ian, let's continue speaking with you just briefly as we move into what the crux of today's conversation is, and that is the African horse sickness vaccine shortage and the problems that have come around this, which Sheilagh's going to help us navigate. But I think what I would really like to touch base on first is, as so many unaffiliated or non-competitive riders want to know, is why is it important for everyone to be aligned on the African horse sickness vaccine issue? There are a lot of people saying, I don't understand why I need to be vaccinated if I don't compete. There's a lot of people trying to wriggle around why must vets be vaccinated, questions like this. Can you just briefly touch on why this is so important for South Africa?
So I think that first off, it's so important because of disease. So, vaccination and movement control certainly has a huge impact on the incidence of disease. So I'm also on the National Horse Racing Authority board, and the key example I'd mention is Marshall Eagle won the Met, and on the same night his mother died of African horse sickness. So we lose much, much more to disease than export will ever bring us. So let's first be clear that we are vaccinating to prevent our horses from getting ill. But then we have a construct of movement control, which, by the way, also impacts on the movement of African horse sickness throughout the country. The movement control and surveillance that we have in place is to protect our Western Cape export zone. In the ideal, so that export zone is principally for the term export. So if we want our top athletes and horses to compete internationally, we need to try and reopen the direct route into Europe and Dubai, and from there to the rest of the world.
And Sheelagh will touch base on that later.
Sheelagh will touch base on that. And indeed, equally, if we ever want to host a major international competition, the only place that we could host it would be Cape Town, and we'd have to create a disease-free zone, basically, to fly in horses that would compete and then leave. So it is a critical feature. I do think in terms of value of horses, certainly the thoroughbreds have got a substantive value once they can be exported. The biggest number of horses that we export are actually endurance horses. And the single highest value horse ever exported was a show jumper. The most valuable horse ever exported was a show jumper. So basically, this is across the board. And if we want our horses to actually compete internationally or to be sold internationally, then we need an export-free African horse.
I think it's also interesting how those high-performance athletes and the export horses, it all trickles down into the economy. So the amount of jobs, Correct. I think there was a statistic a while ago, one racehorse supported 37 jobs.
Correct.
And so I think, as you say, it speaks to the entire community.
It is a shrinking business, shrinking population, but the estimates are that it's about 100,000 jobs that are related to horses, which makes the equestrian industry probably, the second or third largest employer in the country.
It's pretty impressive. So moving on to the horse sickness vaccine issue. Can either of you lead on to what led to the current shortage of the African horse sickness vaccines in South Africa?
Well, I can tell you what I know, and Onderstepoort is the only place that makes African horse sickness vaccine registered. So it's the only, let's say, laboratory in the country that makes it, and they had a problem with the machines that freeze dry. So the problem really has been that they've not been able to manufacture this particular vaccine.
Okay.
And the African horse sickness is a freeze-dried vaccine. So when you get it, you'll see there's a little pellet in the bottom, and then you mix the water with it and reconstitute it.
And that makes it live.
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
So-
it doesn't, mixing it with water doesn't make it live. It is
It's a live
but
vaccine.
it's frozen.
Okay.
And then when you reconstitute it, it does have attenuated live vaccine in it.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's my understanding as well. So Understood Biologic Products
Yes, OBP.
is the single producer of the live attenuated vaccine. It's been around for 30 years at least.
The current vaccine.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's
Yes.
of strains of a virus that have been stored for a number of years. It has regulatory approval. It is used across the continent, so exported
Okay.
to Kenya, Botswana. So, this topic is just as important for G9
Absolutely.
countries,
Okay.
Group 9 countries.
So can we begin with what the correct vaccination schedule in an ideal world with no shortages would be? When should people be vaccinating their horses? And I can tell you this as a competitor, is everyone loved to leave horse sickness vaccines until December when we were all taking our December holidays. And they would say, oh, we'll give the horses a lovely 6 weeks off over December and vaccinate them then. I can see Sheilagh's about to actually have an aneurysm. So can we discuss which vaccine first and why? We did have a question earlier on about, is the second vaccine allowed before the first vaccine?
Yes, there's no restriction or legal issues in terms of whether you give vaccine 1 first or whether you give vaccine 2. What has occurred and through research is that in your naive horses, so your foals and your imported horses, if you give vaccine number 1 first and then follow it up with vaccine number 2 afterwards, what they have discovered is strain 2 in vaccine 1 tends to cause much more of a reaction, particularly when 2 is given afterwards.
Okay.
So
How many strains are in each vaccine, just to recap? for
well, in
listeners?
number 1, you've got 3 strains, so you've got 2, 3, and 4. And then in number 2, you've got 2, 6, 7, and 8. 6 cross-reacts with 9 and 8 with 5. So those 2 are not in the vaccine.
Okay.
So with your imported horses, and as I say, the weanlings, we tend to give number 2 first,
Okay.
and then follow it with number 1. But in my practice, I just found that it became quite difficult to remember who had number 2 first and who had number 1. So I
Okay.
just, as a rule, do number 2 first,
Okay.
and then follow it with number 1. They've also done research that has proven it doesn't matter which one you give first. The immune response and they've tested the antibodies sort of like a month after they've been vaccinated is exactly the same. So it doesn't make a difference to the immune
Okay.
response.
And we spoke yesterday a little bit about vaccinating when and why. That there should be a 30-day or 6-week gap ideal between the vaccines to allow for the correct immune response.
Well, it's an attenuated live vaccine. So when you inject the vaccine, you actually have circulating virus for 40 days. And that's one of the reasons that you can't move to the Western Cape, because there is a live circulating virus. The pamphlet and the regulations are that it must not be given in less than 3 weeks.
Okay.
Because if you give it in less than 3 weeks, it actually makes both of those vaccines invalid.
So there can't be an overlap.
No.
There has to be one vaccine and at least
Yes.
21 days in the second vaccine.
Yes. And you
Okay.
can't get the 2 together because you're running out of time.
Okay.
It's better, I think, to leave longer. The other point I want to also address is that with your naive horses and your imported horses, is that you need to try and get more than one vaccine in that
In the season.
In the season,
Okay. And the season should be from,
usually from June.
okay.
In the Western Cape, it closes on the 31st of October. It's recommended to try and do it before then. From the point of view of the SAEF and sporting horses, it's till the end of the year.
Okay.
What you really don't want is people vaccinating horses at the height of the mid-season, which is usually February through until May or June.
Okay. And that's because, do you mind touching base on that? That basically the midges could then bite a vaccinated horse
and spread it.
okay.
Yes.
So it's a little bit worse than that, right? So the midges can then transmit a vaccine virus into a horse that has infection, and you can get recombination and recrudescence of the vaccine virus to become a live virus that could, in fact, potentially, in its worst form, generate a new strain of virus that we essentially would not be able to vaccinate for until we understand the virus, right? So in the outbreaks that have occurred in the Western Cape have actually been because of vaccinated horses coming into contact with infected horses that then in fact led to a recombination of the virus and an active outbreak. So the package insert speaks about June to October. Actually in the package insert of the vaccine. That is stretched by my veterinary colleagues and their clients to December. But so I personally believe that story completely, and we vaccinate our horses in Johannesburg June to October.
Okay. And I think this also leads on to the discussion about a lot of people want to know, why must a vet be the injector? If this is a welfare issue, why can we not just buy vaccines and inject? But this little bit of liability, you know, that if the vet is more knowledgeable and the vet is going to be more responsible about vaccinating in the correct period, that surely helps everyone.
Well, I think it's more than that, because with a vaccine such as the African horse sickness, there's a cold chain. So it has to be kept in the fridge below a certain degree. And one of the things is that veterinarians belong to a professional body. So you undertake to do things professionally, and when you sign the passport, it's actually a certificate, and that's a legal issue. That becomes a legal document. So any veterinarian who fraudulently signs it, or signs something that they have not done, and signs a vaccine that somebody else has given or the layperson has given, can be had up on disciplinary charges under their professional body, which happens to be the South African Veterinary Council.
So it keeps everyone honest.
Well, that's part of it, yes. I mean, I can remember going in the days where it wasn't regulated that vets do vaccines, and my client said, would I mind giving an African horse sickness while I was there? And she had it. Could I give it? She went to her drawer and pulled out the vaccine. So it's useless by then.
Okay.
Yeah, so both in the SAEF jurisdiction as well as the NHA, we basically say competition horses have to bring a passport that with vaccination scheduled by a vet. It's also for the protection of the other horses that are attending the competition. So
it's the integrity of the entire system.
Right.
Depends on that.
And we do actually follow up on that. So misrepresented passports is a disciplinary.
Okay. Then this is a question from the Western Cape, from Catherine Moore. If we could discuss briefly the difference between the zones, and if we could have that graphic coming up. There are 4 zones: the infected zone, the protection zone, the surveillance zone, and the free zone.
Yes.
So we'll check if that's coming up.
Just to go back a little bit, and that is that the EU, and I think it's the OIE terrestrial code, says that you cannot export horses from an African horse sickness endemic area. And in order to get around this in the 1990s, I think Alan Guthrie was very involved in this, is that the only way that South Africa would ever be able to export horses would be to make an area of this country free.
Okay.
And it was deemed through research that the Western Cape was the ideal place. And obviously one of the things you have to do is have an international airport. And that is why it came into being. So you have the free zone, which is a very small zone in the Cape. And then
that's the Kenilworth quarantine.
That's the Kenilworth quarantine and the Kenilworth racecourse. And then you have the surveillance zone, which is basically within the mountains and the Cape Peninsula and up to Stellenbosch, that sort of area. over the mountains becomes a protection zone.
Okay.
So what happens is in the free and the surveillance zone, vaccination is not mandatory, and you should not be vaccinating your horse unless you wish to move your horse outside those zones.
Okay.
And then you have to apply for permission written. You get, in order to vaccinate your horse, it has to be done by a vet, and it has to be done in that period from the 1st of June to the 31st of October.
Okay.
In the protection zone, you have to vaccinate because that is a buffer zone
Okay.
protecting the free zone. So there you do have to vaccinate, again within the limitation of the 1st of June to the 31st of October. If you move from an area of high, from the free zone, so it's a higher level of security,
Yes.
to a lower level, you can do so
Freely.
So you can go out of the free and the surveillance zone, and you can go into the infected zone. The problem arises when you want to come back
Okay.
from the infected zone into the free zone.
Because you could be bringing horse sickness with you.
Well, you could be. So there's a whole protocol in terms of when you can move. So you go in the low time of the year when there's not a lot of midges, like usually June through until the end of or the beginning of February, where there's no incidence of African horse sickness. And you can then move to the Cape, provided you've got the necessary permit and you undergo the necessary health check before you move. At the other times of the year, for instance, and it varies from province to province, you could move provided you have a negative PCR within 72 hours of the horse moving, and then it has to go to what they call a stopover quarantine.
And is that like the Beaufort West station?
That's
the
one of them.
horses?
There's
Okay.
one in Taos River,
Okay.
and I think there's another one in George that they allow.
Okay.
And then 10 days later, you have to have another PCR.
Because that's the incubation period.
Yes.
So a horse could have been bitten even after getting the first negative
Yes,
PCR test.
yes. Once that's done and it's negative, then it's free to move.
Okay.
So, like for instance, Limpopo would always be a high-risk area. They would
Okay.
not allow you to move into the Western Cape without stopover at any time of the year.
Okay. No,
So-
that's, yes.
So there's a couple of really interesting pieces about how African horse sickness arises each year.
Yes.
It actually comes, so the current state of knowledge is that there's a endemic pool amongst zebra
And that's like the reservoir host.
the reservoir host that in essence overwinters, that continues to transmit. Zebra are not that, do not
Susceptible,
become
yeah.
disease prevalent, yeah. And then, so from the Kruger National Park through Limpopo and in KZN from their parks through to KwaZulu-Natal, the incidence of African horse sickness moves through the country.
And I suppose it's because it's temperate there all year round, so
Right.
there's no good frost to kill off the...
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the hop, skip, and jump occurs with movement. So Eastern Cape, Port Elizabeth area tends to in fact be movement of infected horses from KZN to
Oh, that's
Eastern
really
Cape.
interesting.
And surveillance and movement control across the country is also intended to stop that hop, skip, and jump through our country. And then the other really interesting thing about the free and surveillance zone is that I used to run the Equine Research Fund at WITS.
yeah.
And I handed over to the South African Export Horse Protocol Team, SAEHP. We set up surveillance. So there's actually a gridding of all horses. There's actually even microchipping of the cart horses in the Western Cape.
That's incredible.
And there's a gridding of all horses, and there's a sampling at routine intervals to check that African horse sickness is not occurring in unvaccinated horses in the Western Cape.
But you also do it in the zebras. You have sentinel zebras there.
And you have sentinel zebras there as well in that
Whose
zone.
job is it to go and test the zebra? That sounds like a terrible
John
job.
Brewer and Camilla run that program.
Well done, Camilla.
And indeed, it's really intricate and interesting work.
That's fascinating.
That goes together with the national surveillance. So
Okay.
all positive cases need to be reported. It's actually
And how often does
reported
that
disease.
mapping happen? Like monthly or
So
only in the high
the
season?
surveillance happens, I believe, monthly.
They get, for instance, the Western Cape will get a report monthly from all the provinces, from the state vets.
That's great. Okay.
And then that also informs them of what areas they can now open or what areas they need
And the
to
more you guys
close.
speak, I mean, this is a massive undertaking.
Correct. So
Okay.
we need to acknowledge at the moment that the Hong Kong Jockey Club put in place a additional commingling bet on our major races, and in Hong Kong they generated a large turnover and indeed gave half of the proceeds from that additional turnover to South Africa
That's
through
incredible.
the NHA to SAEHP, an amount of around 12 million rand to actually keep the surveillance and all the epidemiology activities ongoing.
That's phenomenal. That's
The
really
cost
wonderful.
of running the movement control, etc., is in the region of 12 million a year.
Okay. And then just to briefly touch on this. So if we were able to keep the free zone completely free and we can prove that our vaccination protocols are working, horses could argumentatively fly, they could spend 10 days there.
No, it's
What would it
it's
be?
currently 3 weeks,
Okay.
and I believe that they have done quite a bit of research that they would be able to reduce that to 2 weeks.
Okay.
So this is,
Yes.
okay, so on export, right?
On export,
40,
yes.
40 days residence
Oh, you're talking about
Sorry,
stopover.
no, for export.
For
Yes.
export.
Yes, 3 weeks, and I think they will reduce it to 2.
Yeah, so it's 40 days residency in the Western Cape.
Okay.
The plan is to then do a PCR test, go into quarantine at Kenilworth. At the moment, as Sheelagh says, 21 days. We're hoping as soon as we're open, we can negotiate with the OIE to get that down to 14 days. And then a second PCR, and then an all-in, all-out principle. If everybody's well, then the flight probably in closed containers, vector protected, good words,
Yeah.
vector protected containers
got
to
it
the
here.
airport,
Okay.
and then onto the plane and out. We are hoping the audit will happen on begin on the 17th of October. We've had a 2-year disease-free period. We were scuppered by COVID, otherwise this should have happened earlier.
Okay.
Once the audit has been done, the EU, it's an EU audit, European Union
Okay.
audit, they believe that we would be in a position, should we pass the audit, to actually be open in January.
That's fantastic. Because at the moment they have to go out via Mauritius.
Yeah, so a 3-month period at a cost of in excess of 200,000 Rand. Certainly a direct export would be much more feasible and a far lower
Okay.
cost.
That's fantastic. So moving on to the, we wanted to speak a little bit about the quarantining for shows, but I think we have touched on that, Sheelagh. What is the new accepted protocol for horse sickness vaccinations, considering the current shortage? So obviously,
The SAEF, last year we did have a shortage. So the SAEF, we've long ago agreed that horses that compete at SAEF sanctioned shows in the Western Cape do not require African horse sickness to compete if they stay in the free and surveillance zone.
that makes sense.
If they move out, just as the Western Cape protocol is, then they will have to have vaccinations. So we put that in some couple of years ago. Then last year we had this shortage, and in order to accommodate, particularly I think those on the Western Cape, because the shortage was in the critical time when they needed to be vaccinated. We put out a dispensation that we would allow one AHS1 and one AHS2 between the 1st of June 2020 and the 31st of October 2022. Now, we know that there's been some release of stock. Some vets have got adequate stock, but there's still a lot of veterinarians who haven't. But there's still time, particularly in the infected zone, that we can be giving African horse sickness. But should we reach the deadline of the 31st of October and the situation has not improved, we will have to
Extend.
We'll have to extend it, or we'll have to do something, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so from an EXCO point of view, we did at the recommendation of the veterinary committee, we did extend the vaccination window to basically once in the last 2 years. And we're clearly watching this as the NHA is. We're watching this situation to make a decision again toward the end of October. I think, Sheelagh, can you also say something to the prioritization of the vaccine?
Who should be getting the vaccines?
Who should we, in a limited, when we've got limited stocks available, who should we prioritize?
And I think it's very important that the African horse sickness vaccine is not just for sporting horses. So we decided as the Equine Veterinary Association that what we should do, and together with Camilla and the SAEF, that we should try and prioritize those horses that are naive. So all the imported horses, we've had a lot of horses that have come in this year.
True.
Your youngsters, your foals, they need to be vaccinated. They would be considered naive.
And you said you would be trying to get ideally 2 doses into those horses. So
Ideally,
2 AHS1,
yes.
2
Yes.
within this June to October period.
Correct.
Okay.
And then following that, it would be horses that have had less than 5 vaccines.
Okay.
And then obviously after that, then if there was sufficient, then we would vaccinate, I suppose, sporting horses.
Okay.
So the majority of our members, right, unless they're breeders, are dealing with older horses that have been vaccinated every year upon year.
I've got a good immunity.
They are, want to do the best for their horse, but actually in the same way that we started with COVID vaccine going to healthcare workers first, you have to create a prioritization when there's a limited stock.
Okay.
And we'd really, ask members to pay attention to this prioritization. A young weanling that gets, so there were studs last year that had outbreaks amongst the amongst their mares and weanlings, and it's like, a third of the
That's horrendous.
foals died, right? And
is that from the mares not being injected in that last
no,
trimester?
the mares have got it, do pass some immunity on to foals, but it is in the older, that wanes over time, and the exposure was significant. So we really do want to prioritize the weaned foals and the yearlings and the imported horses, the naive horses, and then work our way towards the rest.
Okay.
Eventually, we hope that Honest Put will catch up.
We do have a couple of questions here. Margaret Meeker says, what sort of test can be done to ensure that the cold chain for the vaccinations has not been broken, especially considering, unfortunately, load shedding, which will be hitting this office at 8 o'clock?
You can, but you have to have the vaccine to do so.
Okay.
So you could test it, because you could
So you take a sample vaccine.
Yes, but you really have to have the vaccine to do it.
Okay.
So,
And that's not an answer you're going to get over, immediately.
So you'd have to, this is again why you would hopefully be trusting that your vets are responsible and have
Yes.
generators and sufficient protocols in place.
correct, and it's even the cold chain from the vet's fridge to the client's house, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the breaking that cold chain would make it inactive, quickly within hours.
Oh, that's horrifying. Margaret Meeker also asked if we have any stats about the mortality rate in years where there are vaccination shortages versus not. And you just spoke now about the foals that SADS had critical losses last year.
I had to give a report to the FEI, and I got the stats from Camilla. And interestingly enough, last year, up till April this year, so when I say last year, due to the lack of vaccinations last year, our horse sickness time is in the first half of the year rather than right now. But it wasn't outrageous. We've had worse years. We had, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was, I think, less than 200 AHS.
Okay.
But there was an awful lot of equine encephalosis virus. And I think the biggest culprit that was on the reported list was actually biliary, either your Theileria equi or the Babesia cabali.
But I mean, any good vaccination program does rely on historical vaccinations as well. So we could be in for a bumper year if people do avoid
If we
it.
don't get vaccine,
Yeah, the longer we have no vaccine, the more at risk we
Okay.
are. And I would also highlight that what worries me, and I'm almost scared to say this, but yesterday the Department of Agriculture stopped all movement of cattle in this country because of foot and mouth disease. Another vaccine that's produced by Onderstepoort, and another vaccine that was affected by these shortages.
Okay.
And so indeed, I am worried that we could have a knee-jerk reaction to stop all movement of horses in this country.
And that would obviously affect
Stop
the high-end
all-
competitors
Yeah, but-
massively.
Right. Stop all competition.
Another question from Sylvia Bruckner in the Western Cape. She wants to know, when was the last horse exported directly from Cape Town to the EU? And is it worth it for the huge expense incurred by the Cape Town athletes, which we were actually discussing, Sylvia, just before the podcast started?
Thank you, Sylvia, for the question. So I do think that even...
2002.
You're right. So the 2000 and... No, it must be later than that, right? It must be around 2008. There was a break between 2002 2008.
Okay.
However, I would say that the Mauritius pathway is also being tightened up because Mauritius, unless they import from Cape Town, will soon no longer be recognized as a disease-free country and therefore will have no export.
I'm sure.
So to Sylvia's question, there's benefits to living in the Western Cape. I've had this conversation with her because...
Quality of life benefits?
Exactly,
Okay.
but also African horse sickness benefits because the incidence is highly monitored, extremely low. And unfortunately, the Western Cape has been determined to be the economic hub for the export of horses. It is under regulations from the Department of Agriculture, rather of the Western Cape, rather than SAEF. We don't make this decision.
Okay. I'm just checking there if we have any more questions. And then...
Maybe one other thing to answer Sylvia. I do think that the disciplines need to contemplate supporting Western Cape riders to actually come to competition in other provinces.
And how so when you say support them?
I think it's in travel and in terms of the extra cost of return with
The
quarantine,
mandatory
et cetera.
stopovers.
Yeah, the mandatory stopovers. I also think that we are overemphasizing competition in the winter period when vaccination should be occurring. So the NHA has just moved, or the operators of racing have moved to reduce the racing schedule in the months of July and August.
Surely that's tricky though, because you're either racing during a vaccination period or racing during a high vector period.
Yeah, so interestingly, the race horses, because of the nature of their barns, etc., have got a very low incidence of African horse sickness compared to sports horses and other horses. So they're less. I think they have got respect for the vector, and but indeed that they're reducing their competition to allow for a vaccination period and also to against the hard ground, right?
Yeah.
So we do need the disciplines to start contemplating whether the scheduling of winter events is the right way to go.
Fair enough. And then talking about the quarantine and the vaccination protocol for shows, not vaccination protocol. We discussed yesterday the movement where people they first need to get permission. It depends on the time of year and the active cases.
Yes.
Will you take us through that?
Yes, you cannot put your horse on the horse box and drive down to the Western Cape. You need to get a permit from the Western Cape, and I think it's done through Move My Horse.
And that's Dr. Camilla Vea.
Yes,
Okay.
It's her section. They do that, and then they will check the passport ID, the vaccination status, and in this application you actually have to state what vet you're going to use, because the permits are then sent to the vet. And the vet has to do a health check prior to the horses moving. So like right now, it's open. So Gauteng is open, And that's all they require, is that the vet has checked it, signed the passport. There's an area in the passport that has to be signed where they're coming from and where they're going to, the date you've examined it, and the permit has to go with the passport. When it's a high risk period, which in Gauteng, I think this year was from the first, in fact, I think they only started it in March, the 1st of March, and then it continued into June. So they monitor it. So it's not fixed, but it's roughly that period. You had to go through the same process to get your permit, but then you were required to have a negative PCR. So the vet was required to come and
I'm so sick of hearing the phrase PCR testing. But yes.
No, right.
Yeah.
And then you move to stopover.
Okay.
And then you have another negative PCR, and then you can move into the Western Cape.
Okay.
They can, from the quarantine station at Oliver Tambo, move directly to the Western Cape without vaccination. Because if you've got an imported horse and you have to vaccinate it, it's got to wait 40 days, and then 3 weeks later it's got to wait.
You can't move within 40 days of vaccination.
No.
Okay.
But then they do the second test in the quarantine station, right?
They
do a
yes,
test
but
before
they
release.
also go infected protected.
Yes.
The vehicle is sealed, and then it's only unsealed when it gets to the Cape.
Okay.
For some of the high performance competition, there are recognized venues in Gauteng that can actually quarantine, and the horse goes directly.
Okay.
But that is again in the racing world.
Okay. And then just it's been something that's touched on lately. According to FEI and therefore SAEF regulations, for all vaccines, no horse may compete within 7 days of having a vaccination administered.
Correct. And I think we all wonder, why do we have these regulations? Why do we have vaccinations? It's actually in the interests of horse welfare. So you can and get reactions following a vaccination, and this is to safeguard that you're not competing on a horse that may not be always feeling a bit under the weather or maybe having a reaction.
So we actually recently had cases of this with a period of less than 7 days from an African horse sickness vaccine. I found that astounding. I would not want to take my horse to competition within 21 days.
Then you would be
vaccination.
competing technically in the middle week of the vaccine.
Right.
which-
I mean, it's just I was astounded that this was even a discussion point.
And then there was a question also that came through about vaccine exemption for bad reactions. How do people get a vaccine exemption for horses that?
We've had one and it was refused.
Okay.
And I'll tell you the reasons why, that you're vaccinating horses. And in this case, it was in particular for equine influenza. I haven't really, particularly if you give in naive horses number 2 first, I've not heard of a adverse AHS vaccine reaction.
Okay.
The problem is that equine influenza is highly contagious. And when you take your horse
And this is why we're still vaccinating against it, even though I think our last outbreak was years ago, 2002. Equine flu.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll discuss that. But you vaccinate a horse so that when you go to the show, your horse is protected against picking up diseases from others. But you also protecting everybody else from your horse. And one of the things and why we do still insist on the equine influenza is because it's so highly contagious. And the reason we haven't had an outbreak is because of the regulations pertaining to it and the necessity.
It's almost
to do it.
mysterious, the
Sorry?
correlation between the two. Strict vaccination and no outbreak. It's amazing.
Yeah. But to then say, well, that person doesn't have to be vaccinated, you're putting everybody else's horses at risk.
Okay.
And I think that's a consideration that whilst yours may have a problem, because there are a lot of people who don't want to vaccinate their horses, so they'll all be coming with reactions. But it's not just your horse, but it's all the other horses that horse is going to come into contact with at an event.
So I can't resist to plug this, right? So that's also why we encourage people to, humans, the athletes, to have an influenza vaccine annually, right?
Fair enough.
And the same reason why we recommend COVID vaccination, because indeed you're not doing it for yourself, but you're doing it
And
for
for
the
the most
others
vulnerable
around
of the
you,
population.
right?
Totally.
So the principles are
You'd
the
hope.
same.
Yeah, yeah. Although that didn't go down very well. That's, you know, it's funny. Everyone was very on board with horse sickness vaccines, and then the COVID vaccine came out, and it was a curveball I did not anticipate. We also spoke a little bit about, if I have a new horse that has never had an African horse sickness vaccine, can I work under the current protocol for the dispensation?
Well, if it's never had a vaccine, no.
Okay.
As far as I'm concerned, you have to have one in the last almost,
Almost 3 years now.
well, it's two and a bit
Oh.
years.
Okay.
So if it's never had anything, unless it's been imported, I mean, you cannot compete on a horse if it's a yearling.
Yes.
So how would you be competing if it wasn't already,
Okay.
under saddle and established? So surely somewhere along the line it must have had a vaccine.
No, you would hope.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I think the SAEF is doing is we're actually getting much more passport verification and
Yes.
vaccination verification, not only in the 5 FEI disciplines, but indeed in polo cross, and all the other disciplines. And I think our experience is that in fact the disciplines that have been moving around, that have not had as much strict attention, have let some of these protocols go lax, and we're definitely tightening up on that.
Okay. In brief, Sheelagh, what other vaccines are not compulsory but are recommended? We can obviously take this into another session if we get enough feedback and request for it.
Yes, those are the only two that are regulated, that are compulsory. I think in South Africa we should be doing tetanus. We have West Nile virus. We have the equine herpes virus. Depending upon where you are in the country, rabies vaccination, and then also certain areas, botulism.
Okay.
So you would need to really discuss it with your local vet to see. There are certain areas in the country that have quite a high incidence of botulism, and then obviously rabies.
And equine herpes virus, of course, they had that outbreak in the EU recently, so
Yes,
that's
yeah.
become a trending topic again. There were some comments from Catherine Moore. If anyone is struggling with entering a competition without having a vaccination record, she said to please contact the Western Cape Show Jumping Association. But I have spoken to Charlene Fenter, the Secretary General for the SAEF, and she says please do escalate that directly to your discipline association, and they will assist you if there is any error such as that on the system. And I'm looking at the time. We're about to be hit by load shedding here at Pear House in Kyalami, the home of the South African Equestrian Federation, and now the podcast straight from the horse's mouth. I'd like to thank both Ian and Sheelagh for joining us here this evening. And this is just a reminder to please touch base with us. Our email address is podcast@saef.org.za. If you have any suggestions for topics that you would like covered, any more questions about this, we can always reel Sheelagh and Ian back in here to answer more questions. Otherwise, we look forward to catching up with everyone next week.